Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, my friend.
You bet.
And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. After two New York City police officers were ambushed and killed in an unprovoked shooting as they sat in their patrol car on Saturday, the funeral arrangements for one of the officers have now been set. Officer Rafael Ramos was in his third year on the force when he was killed on Saturday. His family says there will be a viewing for him on Friday, this upcoming Friday, the day after Christmas. And then on Saturday at 10 a.m. in Queens, New York, there's going to be a funeral for Officer Ramos. Now, whenever a police officer is killed in the line of duty in the United States, the funeral is a big deal. At line of duty funerals, you will often see not just local law enforcement, but police officers from all over the country. In this instance, that may be doubly true because of the nature of this killing in particular. The other officer who was killed on Saturday was a 7-year veteran named Wen Liu. As of tonight, funeral details have not been scheduled for Officer Liu, in part because part of his family is in China, and authorities are trying to expedite the visa process so his family members can be here in New York for the funeral. So we know when Officer Ramos's funeral is going to be. That's going to be Saturday. We do not yet know when the funeral is going to be for Officer Liu. But when we get that second date for Officer Liu, both of those are going to be very important dates to watch now in terms of how the country continues to respond to these officers being killed, and also to the broader context of the anti-police brutality protests that have been happening all over the country for weeks now. Protests the killer referenced in his online postings the day he shot those officers in New York. Today, New York City's Mayor Bill de Blasio asked for a pause in those ongoing protests until after the two officers can be laid to rest.
I'm asking everyone, and this is across the spectrum, to put aside protests, put aside demonstrations. Until these funerals are passed, let's focus just on these families and what they have lost. I think that's the right way to try and build towards a more unified and decent city.
Nobody knows if the protests are going to stop, but Mayor Bill de Blasio and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and even the Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, who himself is a retired captain in the NYPD and who's been very outspoken on issues of race and policing, they all those local leaders made the same call today, that protests about police use of force should not necessarily stop altogether, but they should stop for a few days. They're basically calling for a cooling off period to keep the focus on the officers who just lost their lives rather than the loss of those officers' lives turning into a proxy for more political fighting. But as we look ahead to the officers' funerals, and as officials try to cool down some of the very hot political reaction to these killings this weekend, the shooting itself remains an open investigation, with police saying there are a number of elements of what happened here that they do not yet fully understand. Obviously, they know who did it, they know the bottom line of what happened, and that these two officers lost their lives, and that the man who killed them killed himself thereafter. But there are important elements of the shooting that they say they have still not yet figured out. Here's what we do know in terms of the very compressed, very dramatic timeline of what happened on Saturday. 5:51 a.m. on Saturday morning, police in Owings Mills, Maryland, which is Baltimore County, Maryland, they got a call from an apartment building with a report of a shooting. A 29-year-old woman had been shot in the abdomen. She was seriously hurt but alive. Her name is Shanika Thompson, and she was able to tell officers what had happened to her. She said that she was shot by her ex-boyfriend, by this man, Ishmael Brinsley. And that he had fled the apartment after shooting her, and that he had taken her cell phone with him when he left. He left his own cell phone behind in her apartment, and he took her phone with him. And it ended up being crucial that he had her cell phone and that police knew that he had her cell phone, because within 40 minutes of Baltimore County Police first responding to that early morning shooting, they were able to track the victim's phone and thereby follow Ishmael Brinsley's whereabouts as he fled the scene. By 7:46 a.m. on Saturday morning, they had signals from that cell phone indicating that he was traveling northbound on Interstate 95. Apparently, he was taking a bus from the Baltimore area toward New York City. From 8:30 a.m. until after 10 a.m. that morning, Saturday morning, they were able to track the location of the cell phone northbound on I-95 into New Jersey. At 10:24 a.m., Baltimore County Police, tracking that cell phone, were able to see that the man had entered the Lincoln Tunnel to cross from New Jersey into New York City. Just before 11 a.m., he got off the bus in Midtown Manhattan. He then got on a subway train at the Times Square subway station, and he took the subway to Brooklyn. Just past noon, 12:07 p.m. on Saturday, having arrived in Brooklyn, Ishmael Brinsley ditched the ex-girlfriend's phone. And then the next 2 hours are somewhat mysterious and critical to this case, and ultimately very scary.
We're seeking the community's assistance with this very important investigation. We've been able to establish the whereabouts of Ishmael Brinsley from the early morning hours of Saturday the 20th, when he's in Maryland, through his travel up to New York, from Manhattan and indeed into Brooklyn. What we do have is a gap in his movements for about 2 hours and 30 minutes. Between 12 o'clock and 2:30 p.m. when we believe he's in the Fort Greene section of Brooklyn, Fort Greene or Bed-Stuy.
What you see over here is some images. We have a tape of Atlantic Center Mall, where he is, where he's walking around. And if I could play that tape. We're asking the public's assistance if they've seen him, because right now we don't know where he was for 2 hours.
So what's happening between noon and 2:30 is that this guy is wanted for the shooting in Maryland. Baltimore County Police have been able to track him as he left the state of Maryland and headed north into New York City. They could track him that far. They could track him from Maryland all the way north up I-95 into New Jersey, into New York, into Manhattan, and then into Brooklyn. They could track him that far, but then he ditched the phone they were using to track him. What also happens in this two and a half hour period is that friends and family of Shanika Thompson, friends and family of the woman who he shot that morning, came forward and told the Baltimore County Police, hey, look what this guy's been posting online all day. He had posted on Instagram about the fact that he had shot his ex-girlfriend that morning. He'd also posted explicitly a picture of a gun and a threat that he planned to kill police officers that day. And they knew that he had gone to New York. So that information happened at about 1:30 p.m. 1:30 p.m. is when Baltimore County Police learned about these threats that this guy was making online. By 1:45, the Baltimore County Police had prepared a wanted flyer with the man's picture on it and with this very explicit warning. Suspect is armed with a 9mm handgun and has posted pictures on his Instagram saying he will shoot a police officer today. By just past 2 o'clock, by 2:10 p.m., the Baltimore police are on the phone with police in Brooklyn, warning the Brooklyn police that they believe this guy has a gun, they believe he's already shot somebody today, they believe he has arrived in New York City, and that he is saying he's going to kill police officers today. At 2:46 p.m., the Baltimore County Police send the NYPD that wanted poster they had prepared so the NYPD can start to distribute it, so police officers can be on the lookout. They send that from Maryland to New York City at 2:46 p.m. 2 minutes later, at 2:48 p.m., it is too late. On Tompkins Avenue in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, Officer Liu and Officer Ramos never had a chance, never had a warning. Ishmael Brinsley apparently walked up to their patrol car from behind and just without warning and without saying anything started shooting into the vehicle. Both officers were killed at the scene. After shooting the officers, Ishmael Brinsley ran one long block down Myrtle Avenue, went into a subway station. 2 utility workers apparently saw him and told police where he had gone. Police chased him down into the subway station, whereupon Ishmael Brinsley used the same gun that he had just used to shoot the 2 officers, which he had used that morning to shoot his ex-girlfriend. And standing on the subway platform, he put the gun to his own head and he killed himself. Between the time when he ditched the cell phone at 12:07 p.m. and when those police officers were shot and killed at 2:48 p.m., that time period, police say they are intensely interested in finding out anything they can about what happened in that time period, where he was, what he did, and if he spoke to anyone, and if he did, what he said. The police commissioner announced today that the working theory here is that he acted alone, but they cannot rule anything out until they've actually ruled it out. And so now they need to make sure that this was, as it seems, an isolated incident of a man acting alone and that there's not an ongoing threat to officers either in New York or anywhere else.
Investigation that we have conducted so far leads us to believe that he acted alone. Early on, there was concern that was he, in fact, a lone player. Nothing in the investigation up to this point would lead us to believe that he was anything but a solo operator, if you will. However, since the incident, we've received a number of what I would describe as copycat types of threats, and we have been investigating those, as you would expect, with incredible care.
The point that I think here that, again, the Commissioner said there have been copycat threats. Anything like that needs to be taken very seriously. I just want to emphasize that the simplest thing any New Yorker can do is call 911. I want to make sure and I'm asking all of our colleagues in the media to please get this message out. If you hear someone make a physical threat against a police officer, if you see something on social media that is a threat against a police officer, call 911 immediately. We would much rather get too much information than too little.
After these two police officers were killed on Saturday, police say there's no reason to believe that the killer was working with anybody else or that it was part of some larger ongoing plot, even as they continue to track down every last thing they can about what happened. Police are taking every precaution to make sure, including trying to find out where he went and who he talked to in New York City in that lost 2.5 hours between when he ditched the phone they were using to track him and when he killed the police officers and then killed himself. Although this man referenced the police killings of Michael Brown in Missouri and Eric Garner in Staten Island in his Instagram threat to kill police officers before he went ahead and did so, police say the only link they can find so far between him and the protest movement around those deaths was that he appears to have taken a cell phone video of one protest as a bystander in New York City earlier this month.
We have recovered his cell phone from Baltimore. And there's over several thousand images on it, and we're tearing down on that as well. One of the cell phone images that we have is a video of Union Square Park, where he is a spectator watching one of the protests. We date that at around December 1st. Again, he's just a spectator, it seems, as people walking by. He's recording it on his cell phone.
The threat to kill these officers was couched online in reference to the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. That said, according to police at this point in their investigation, it seems that the suspect did not have meaningful ties to that protest movement. In fact, what it seems striking about him is that he had little ties to anyone or anything at all. Ishmael Brinsley had been arrested at least 19 times in the past decade since he turned 18. He'd been arrested for misdemeanor assault, for shoplifting, grand larceny, gun possession, a lot of other offenses. He apparently dropped out of school in the 10th grade. Law enforcement officials have said they have not been able to even locate any current address for him. Doesn't seem to have any employment history of any note as well. In 2010, he reportedly threatened to kill a woman after getting into an argument with her at a Waffle House in Atlanta. He threw a drink at the woman, said he would return with a knife. Mr. Brinsley's mother has told law enforcement officers that she was afraid of him. She was scared of her own son. His siblings have denied having any contact with him for years. Mr. Brinsley's mother has also told authorities that he suffered from some form of mental illness. She told police he had tried to commit suicide in the past, including trying to hang himself last year. She said he had been institutionalized at some point. The ex-girlfriend who he shot and wounded on Saturday morning told police that he held his gun to his own head during that confrontation in her apartment, threatening to kill himself with the gun before he shot her instead. So aside from the issue of whether he acted alone, and if he did act alone, whether he was guided by some ideology, whether these murders were connected to some ultimate goal in his mind, this was someone who seems to have had very little connection with others in his day-to-day life unless it was to threaten people. He seems to have been very alone and very troubled and very repeatedly violent. This is the makeshift memorial that's been set up on the street where those two officers died on Saturday afternoon. This is a time of incredible tension, not just in New York City, but around the country. There was a renewed effort today to keep the focus on the officers who were just killed so that they do not represent something larger without us remembering who they were as men. Calls from several New York City officials today, the head of the police union and the mayor included, to keep the political debate turned off until these two officers can be laid to rest.